This is the second part of Lesson 4.6. We'll call this Lesson 4.6 Part 2. And in the first part, we dealt primarily or solely on factoring polynomials. We learned some new factoring techniques. And then today, we're going to spend our time on solving polynomial equations. That's what this lesson will revolve around. So what we learned in the previous lesson, certain ways to factor, are going to be used to help us solve certain types of polynomial equations. And so let me get to our notes where we pick up. So we went through exercise or example 3 with the part 1 notes. So here we are with example 4, and I just have 4 different problem types to go over with you, 4 different examples to go over with you. So this is letter A represents what is known as a quartic, that's degree 4, trinomial. And it's an equation, of course, so anytime you see equals, that means it's going to be your job to come up with all of the solutions for x that would, if we took those numbers, plugged them in for x, it would make this a true statement. And remember that when you're dealing with a polynomial equation like this, the degree of the polynomial will always tell you how many solutions you should come up with. So when I'm done with this equation, I should end up with 4 solutions. So let me show you how to come up with those solutions using factoring. Well, let's go back in time just a little bit to something more familiar. It's related but not exact, but I think once you've seen a familiar form of factoring, and then when you compare it to what we're about to do here, it's going to all come back and really make this a pretty easy equation to factor and then solve. Well, let's think of this in terms of a quadratic, meaning x squared plus x minus 6. You could think of this maybe as the quadratic cousin of this quartic trinomial. Well, this should be easy for us to factor. We've done factoring like this quite a bit in Algebra 1 and in Algebra 2. So if we were factoring this quadratic, the factors of -6 that add up to +1, we would say that that would be x plus 3 times x minus 2. Okay, using FOIL to double check, we would get this quadratic trinomial. Well, if you understand this factoring, then it makes the factoring of these quartic trinomials really very easy, because all we have to do when we come back over here to the quartic side is make these become x squared. X squared. So you see how easy it is if you understand what we've been doing in the past, how to relate that to what we're doing currently. Now we're not done. Remember, our job is to find the 4 solutions for x. It's the factoring, however, that will help us get to the solutions pretty quickly and easily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these factors. I've got 2 factors. X squared plus 3 is a factor. Notice I'm multiplying 2 binomials together. X squared plus 3 is a factor. And then the other factor is x squared minus 2. Let's just take each one of those factors and make them equal to 0. And we're going to solve for x within each of these little mini equations that we made out of each factor. So I'll come over here where I've got more room. Now that you've seen our quadratic example, I can erase this. So solving this left equation, I would get x squared equals -3, and x equals plus minus. Don't forget, square root of both sides of an equation, we've got to include plus minus. Plus minus the square root of -3. Well, I never leave the square root of a negative number. I need to simplify that using the number I. So the simplified form would be plus minus I times the square root of 3. That represents two solutions because one's plus, one's minus. Okay, now let's do the other factor. And if we add 2 to both sides, we get x squared equals 2. Then x is going to be plus minus the square root of 2. That represents two more factors, or solutions. So two solutions here, total of 4. We got all of the solutions that we were asked to find. And that ends up being our total final answer, or you could think of answers, to example 4a. 4b is very much like it. If you think of it in terms of the quadratic form, think of the factors of -6 that add up to +5. And we're going to factor it not as two linear binomials, but two quadratic binomials. Okay? We're going to have x squared and x squared to make x to the 4th. And the factors of -6 that add up to +5, that would be +6, -1. Okay, and now that's the factored form of this equation. And now take each factor separately, make each factor equal 0, and solve for x in each case. Over here we're going to get x squared equals 1. X is plus minus the square root of 1, which is 1. So two of my solutions will be plus minus 1. Now let's solve this. X squared is equal to -6. X is equal to plus minus the square root of -6. But once again, you never want to leave the negative number under a radical. It needs to be simplified using the number I times the square root of 6, of course, plus minus. So we started out needing 4 solutions, and we have all 4. 2 are here, and 2 are here. Okay, letter C represents another type of factoring that we're going to need to do. And fortunately, we've already prepared for this because yesterday's lesson and last night's homework dealt with the way to factor the sum of two perfect cubes. And that's what we have here. So remember, it starts with finding those cube roots. The cube root of x to the 3rd is x. Whatever that sign is in the problem, I repeat it. The cube root of 8 is 2. And now I'm going to make a trinomial factor from this binomial. So this first term in the binomial, I square it. Minus, now I'm going to multiply these together. 2 times x is 2x. Plus, and now I'm going to raise this to the 2nd power. 2 squared is 4. Okay, this time, this is a cubic binomial. This time I'm going to be looking for 3 solutions. One of them is pretty easy. If I just take this factor x plus 2 and let it equal 0 and solve for x, I'm going to find x, and that's -2. This one, however, this quadratic trinomial isn't going to be quite as easy. Not difficult, but it's not going to be quite as easy as this. I can't factor this. Remember, if you're trying to solve a quadratic equation, factoring hopefully will work, but in this case it doesn't, so I'm going to have to resort to other methods like the quadratic formula or completing the square. We know how to do both of those. You can choose. I'm going to use the quadratic formula because I think that's what most people would choose. So solving for x, I'm going to do the opposite of b, plus minus the square root of b squared, -2 squared is 4, minus 4 times 1 times 4, that's 16, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, and simplifying underneath the radical, the square root of -12, all over 2. And now going back and remembering how we simplify radicals, well, I know it's going to involve the number I because I've got the square root of a negative, And I also know that the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 is equal to 12, and the square root of 4 is 2. So instead of saying I2, I'm going to write 2I and then times the square root of 3. 2I because it's negative, and then the square root of 3 cannot be simplified. All of that over 2. And now don't forget, we have that possibility here to reduce, because all of these numbers that are not under the radical are divisible by the same number. And so 2 divided by 2 is just 1. Plus minus. 2 divided by 2 again, 1. I square root of 3. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1. Don't need to write over 1. So that ends up being my other two solutions, because it's 1 plus I root 3 and 1 minus I root 3 to go along with our first solution, negative 2. Okay, so now we're back to what we did previously. Here's another one of those quartic trinomials. So think of it the way you would a quadratic trinomial. Are there factors of negative 10 that add up to negative 3? Well, certainly there are. That would be negative 5 and positive 2. So instead of having linear binomials, we're going to have quadratic binomials. Negative 5 will be in one group and plus 2 in the other. So now, again, we're looking for 4 solutions. Let's let each of these factors equal 0 and solve for x. So x squared is equal to 5. X is going to be plus minus the square root of 5. 2 solutions. Over here, x squared is going to be negative 2. X is going to be plus minus I. Remember, it's the square root of a negative number. I times the square root of 2. There's 2 more solutions for a total of 4 solutions. So that represents the rest of the types of problems that you're going to see in lesson 4.6. And so that concludes the whole lesson. Now I hope you'll really practice well on all the different types of factoring. Some of the problems, all you're doing is factoring, but if you see equals, you are doing factoring, but then you need to take the next step. The whole point of an equation is to find all of the solutions, all of the numbers that would plug in for x to make this a true statement. So I hope that helps you, and work hard on it, and we'll see you next time.